They always think the worst of you when you keep things in boxes. Too neat, too organized, that's suspicious in a place where chaos is the rule. Where everyone's clinging to scraps of warmth and sanity like driftwood in a flood, a sealed box under your bed might as well be a vault of secrets. I watched them whisper about mine for weeks. It wasn't the hoarding they feared, it was the order. That's the part no one talks about when you fall. If you fall too gracefully, if you still try to hold on to structure, routine, dignity, they look at you sideways. Like you're cheating the system somehow, pretending you don't belong in the wreckage. But I do belong here. The difference is, I remember what the world looked like before it cracked, and I remember how to rebuild it. There wasn't a single, cinematic moment where everything fell apart. No grand betrayal, no explosive argument, no blaze of glory. Just a slow, quiet crumbling, maddening in its subtlety. Like water damage behind drywall, invisible until the structure was already rotting. Dana used to be someone people called when things went to hell. Wildfires, levee breaks, hurricanes with names the world would remember for months. While others panicked, she assessed. While others waited for orders, she made maps in her head and rewired supply chains with a dry erase marker. Her badge had weight. Her voice cut through the noise. She carried a clipboard like it was a weapon, and in some ways, it was. 15 years in emergency response. 3 states. Dozens of natural disasters. She was the calm in everyone else's chaos, until one day the chaos turned inward and no one showed up with a clipboard for her. It started with funding cuts, then department reassignments. Her latest supervisor, young, enthusiastic, spreadsheet-obsessed, called it a strategic pivot. It sounded like a marketing term, not a human resource policy. Her role was made redundant. Just like that. No one fought for her. No one even blinked. She'd spent a career building structures no one noticed until they failed, and now she was one of them. She packed her things into a banker's box, numb fingers folding awards and thank you letters into folders like they might mean something in the next life. Her office plant, once vibrant from window light, looked as stunned as she felt. Outside, no one noticed when she walked away from the only thing she'd ever built for herself. The job had been her spine. Without it, she sagged in places she hadn't realized were propped up. Consulting was a joke. Companies wanted energy and buzzwords, not trauma-seasoned professionals who looked like they hadn't slept in a decade. She dumbed down her resume. Still no bites. Her network thinned. Calls went unanswered. No one knew what to do with a woman whose best skill was managing disaster, unless they were in one. The savings drained slower than expected, which made it worse. She watched every dollar leave her like a slow goodbye. At first, she kept the routines. Coffee at 6. Jog around the block. Check the job boards. Week 2, she replaced the jog with a walk. Week 4, the coffee vanished. The job boards became a graveyard of entry-level listings that paid an exposure or temp contracts with expiration dates shorter than a carton of milk. Her apartment was last to go. She sold her car to cover the last 2 months of rent, convinced, naively, stupidly, that something would come through. Something always had before. She'd always found a way to land on her feet. But not this time. The eviction was cold, sterile, merciless. Her neighbors looked away, unsure if acknowledging her would make it contagious. Poverty spreads like a rumor fast and unwanted. She was now the cautionary tale, not the expert. Dana moved through the world like a ghost after that. Not quite visible, not quite dead. Her survival instincts kicked in without ceremony. A new kind of logistics. Where to sleep. Where to stay warm. Which churches handed out peanut butter instead of judgment. She kept her backpack perfectly organized. Hygiene items in one pouch, documents in a waterproof sleeve, socks rolled and stashed with military precision. She wore layers with strategy. She folded blankets tight. There was still dignity in control. But control drew attention. At first, it was curiosity. Then suspicion. She didn't talk much. That was mistake number 1. People who are suffering are expected to perform it. Tears, gratitude, helplessness. Dana didn't do any of that. She planned, she adapted, she blended. That was mistake number 2. Blending without breaking looked like hiding something. In the downtown shelter, her cot was near the back corner, clean, closest to the fire exit. She chose it for its quiet. She'd memorized the rotation of volunteers, knew which ones clocked out early and which ones left supplies unguarded. Not to steal, but to understand. She kept a tally of how often the milk in the cafeteria expired before it was served. She noticed that supplies meant for families often got rerouted to repeat offenders with louder voices. It wasn't judgment. It was just data. But no one wanted her observations. They wanted her silence, or better yet, her absence. The first accusation was whispered behind her back. The second was said directly to her face. "You're hoarding stuff. Acting all organized. Like you're running this place." She blinked at the woman who said it, more confused than insulted. Her backpack was on her cot, zipped, untouched for hours. Nothing hidden. Nothing stolen. Just arranged. She said nothing. And that was mistake number 3. Silence, here, was interpreted as guilt. Barry, one of the staff members, pulled her aside. He was the kind of man who read training manuals like scripture. His eyes never quite met hers when he spoke, like he was afraid of absorbing whatever had brought her here. He used words like protocol and concerns. He asked her, gently but firmly, to reduce her visible possessions. "It's creating tension," he said, as if tidiness was provocative. She wanted to scream, or laugh, or maybe both. But all she did was nod and retreat further into herself. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, counting them like lifelines. She had once mapped evacuation routes for hurricane victims across 3 counties. Now she wasn't trusted with a pack of bandages and 2 granola bars. Still, she observed. Still, she remembered. Every failing system echoed a familiar pattern. Inefficiency, mistrust, misallocated resources. People who shouldn't have power wielding it like a blunt object. It didn't matter if it was a federal agency or a crowded shelter. The same rot always surfaced, only the faces changed. Dana knew the symptoms. And somewhere deep beneath the weariness, a pressure began to build. The kind that didn't break things, but remade them. Like tectonic plates grinding in the dark, ready to shift the landscape when no one was watching. Her time hadn't passed. It was just waiting to erupt. The accusation didn't come all at once. It crawled in like mildew, starting in corners, spreading when no one was looking. Rumors have a way of slipping into empty spaces, and in the shelter, there were plenty. Spaces between meals, between people, between glances, all waiting to be filled with suspicion. At first, it was a missing box of gloves. Not rare, not even notable. Supplies went missing all the time, diverted, repurposed, sometimes even thrown out during volunteer turnover. But this time, someone mentioned Dana's name. A casual comment. Just loud enough to plant an idea. She's always watching. Kinda weird, don't you think? Like she's taking notes. The seed took root. Because Dana wasn't like the others. She didn't beg. She didn't barter. She didn't collapse under the weight of her circumstance the way people found comforting. She didn't seem broken enough. She still carried herself like someone with a plan. The shelter staff never outright accused her, not at first. But the shift was obvious. The conversation stopped when she entered the room. The nightly checks suddenly included glances at her backpack. Questions came wrapped in politeness. "You doing okay, Dana? You need anything? Been keeping to yourself, huh?" Keeping to yourself. That was the phrase that followed her like a scent. It was never a crime to be quiet, until it was. One night, during a food delivery mix-up, the kitchen was short by 30 meals. People were irate, hungry, cold, already hanging by a thread. It didn't take long before someone pointed a finger. Dana was in the corner, her tray untouched. She'd been offered food early that night. One of the volunteers had extra and remembered her from the intake day. A harmless kindness. A fatal detail. "You always seem to get what you want," someone spat. "Bet she's the one skimming." Dana looked up, stunned into stillness. She'd faced down disaster zones, entire towns underwater or burning. But this kind of quiet betrayal felt more dangerous. Because here, there was no rescue coming. No chain of command. Just desperate people, a brittle system, and an easy scapegoat. She didn't argue. Arguing only gave the illusion of defense, and defense was guilt here. The shelter director, Ms. Halpern, called her into the office the next morning. The room was small, cluttered, smelling faintly of antiseptic and oversugared coffee. A corkboard behind the desk displayed schedules, resource lists, and a laminated sheet titled Conflict Resolution Steps in cheerful fonts. "I need to ask you something delicate," Halpern said, folding her hands like a mediator. "There have been concerns." Dana said nothing. She already knew the shape of the conversation. Halpern talked in circles, each sentence lined with disclaimers. She wasn't accusing, of course not. But perhaps Dana had misunderstood the policies. Perhaps she'd overstepped in organizing her space. Perhaps others felt intimidated by her presence. That last one hit like a slap wrapped in velvet. Intimidated how? Dana finally asked. "Well," Halpern said, shifting uncomfortably, "you keep track of things. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it gives the impression of monitoring, and with limited trust among residents. Dana cut her off, voice low. You mean they're uncomfortable because I'm not falling apart like they expect me to? Halpern blinked, surprised by the bluntness. She opened her mouth, closed it, and reached for the clipboard instead. We're just trying to keep the peace, she said finally. Peace. A word that meant order over fairness. Silence over truth. That night, Dana's cot was moved closer to the door. It wasn't punishment, exactly, just a precaution, they said. For safety. She didn't ask whose. But the damage was done. People who once nodded at her now turned their backs. Conversations dried up. Her things were rifled through more than once. She stopped leaving her backpack unattended. She stopped talking altogether. Still, she watched. She saw which staff pocketed supplies after hours, who traded extra toiletries for cigarettes in the alley out back, who got more food than their share and who never got seconds, no matter how early they lined up. The system was a sieve, and people like Dana, quiet, competent, inconvenient, fell through it. But then came the tipping point. A medical emergency. A woman collapsed near the entrance, coughing blood into her sleeve. Panic erupted. Staff shouted over each other. Someone called an ambulance, but no one cleared a path. No one gathered her belongings. People scattered like roaches in sudden light. Dana moved. She wrapped the woman in a thermal blanket before anyone else had even bent down. Cleared the crowd. Called out for gloves, gauze, water. Marked commands like muscle memory had kicked in. The staff stared. Residents froze. For 2 minutes, Dana was back in her element. Then someone said it. She's acting like she runs the place. It wasn't admiration. It was fear. By the time the ambulance left, Dana was back on her cot, hands still trembling from adrenaline. And yet, she knew what would come next. Authority hates unsanctioned competence, especially when it comes from someone they've already dismissed. The next morning, Barry pulled her aside again. His voice was gentler than before, which made it worse. We think it might be time to transition you to another facility, he said. Fresh environment, you know? Reset expectations. She nodded and smiled. Because now she saw it clearly. She wasn't the problem. She was the threat to a problem everyone else had learned to live with. The transfer never happened. Not because they changed their minds, but because Dana never gave them the chance to follow through. The moment Barry's words left his mouth, she knew the clock had started. Transfers took days. Paperwork. Processing. Approval. In the in-between time, she could either shrink or sharpen. She chose the latter. Dana had always known that survival required 2 things, observation and timing. The disaster zones she'd worked in after the hurricane didn't crumble because of the storm itself. They collapsed because people failed to see the cracks in the foundation before the first wind hit. And now, inside the shelter, smaller, slower, but just as vulnerable, those cracks were everywhere. The miscounts in supply inventory. The regular shortages of medication. The gaps in the staff's schedule when coverage was lowest. The so-called lost donation drives that never made it into the books. Dana had been paying attention, even when they thought she was doing nothing at all. Every night, after lights out, she sketched notes in the back pages of a donated thriller novel. She wrote in code, old FEMA shorthand for emergency tags and logistics routes, turned sideways to mark timelines and anomalies. If anyone found it, it'd look like gibberish. But to Dana, it was a blueprint. She mapped supply movement, tracked inconsistencies, connected dots between staff actions and resident reactions. She noticed which residents were singled out more often, which were mysteriously encouraged to leave after speaking up. Patterns formed. Ugly ones. She saw that this place, built on the promise of care, had become a quietly corrupted machine. And she knew how to break machines. The skill wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what people imagine when they thought of heroism. It wasn't martial arts or hacking or legal jargon. It was logistics, emergency management, bureaucratic mastery. The kind that could flood a faulty system with its own paperwork and reveal every dirty hand in the process. Dana began asking questions. Quietly, carefully. She befriended a new intake volunteer, offering small bits of advice, how to track who came through, what forms to duplicate in case files got lost. She noticed the girl, Elise, was nervous, fresh out of school, and terrified of doing something wrong. Dana gave her confidence. Information. A way to feel useful. And then, when the moment was right, she asked for help. Can you pull the intake files from the last month? I think someone's been altering medical access logs. Elise hesitated. Why? Because people are disappearing from the system before they're ever processed. That's not just bad paperwork. That's dangerous. It was a gamble. But Elise had that look Dana had seen 100 times before, someone who wanted to be good in a place that rewarded silence. The kind of person who'd be haunted if they didn't help. Within 2 days, Dana had what she needed. Names missing from records. Staff initials where they shouldn't be. Intake dates with no exit documentation. Dana cross-referenced these with her coded notes, her nighttime scribbles, and observed interactions, and the pattern became undeniable. People weren't just slipping through the cracks. They were being pushed. She drafted a report. Not for the shelter director. Not for Barry. She went higher, bypassed the internal web, and sent it straight to a city liaison tied to FEMA partnerships. Her old credentials wouldn't open doors anymore, but the language she used? It would ring alarms in the right ears. She used phrases like potential mismanagement of vulnerable populations and unauthorized off-grid discharges. Cold, clinical terms that carried weight. That triggered mandatory review. Then she waited. It didn't take long. 3 days later, 2 men in stiff suits arrived during the evening meal. They didn't speak to Dana. They didn't have to. They went straight into Halpern's office. Shut the door. The shelter staff scrambled, some whispering, others trying to look busy. Dana ate her soup slowly, spoon scraping deliberate circles across the bowl. Her hands were steady. The residents sensed it too. The tension. The shift. Something was happening, something big, but no one could name it yet. Later that night, Elise found her. They're reviewing the files, she whispered. I think they're going to do a full audit. Dana nodded. Good. They should. How did you know all of this? Dana looked at her, eyes quiet and calm. I've seen systems break from the inside. This place isn't broken yet, but it's close. That night, Dana lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft rustle of bodies shifting in sleep, the distant hum of traffic beyond the shelter's thin walls. She didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because bringing the truth into the light wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. There would be retaliation, deflection, maybe even punishment. People in power don't fall silently. They claw, scream, gaslight on their way down. She wasn't naive enough to believe the audit alone would fix everything. But the silence was broken now. They could no longer pretend she didn't see. And that was power. The kind that didn't look like much. The kind that didn't need applause. The kind you wield when nobody else will. By morning, everything had changed. The usual rhythm of the shelter, murmured complaints at breakfast, clattering trays, the shuffle of tired bodies bracing for another identical day was broken. Instead, silence ruled. The residents gathered in pockets, speaking in low tones, glancing toward the office hallway where Halpern's door remained ominously closed. A sign was taped hastily to the door, director unavailable until further notice. The desk outside, usually occupied by a stone-faced assistant who managed every request with mechanical indifference, was empty. But Dana knew better than to feel safe. She learned a long time ago that the moment predators feel cornered, they're most dangerous. Barry didn't even wait a full day. He approached during a group session, one she was quietly sitting in the back of, listening as others shared frustrations about the rationing of basic supplies. His smile was brittle. His clipboard clutched tighter than usual. Dana, he said, too loud, interrupting a woman mid-sentence. You're needed for a staff assessment. Now. He didn't ask. He instructed. Dana stood, heart steady. Everyone in the room went still. Barry's voice had always sounded like protocol. Authoritative. Final. But today, the edge is frayed. She followed him down the hall, through a narrow side door, into a cramped room she had never seen before. A single folding chair. A table. One fluorescent light buzzing overhead like a warning. Barry shut the door behind them, didn't sit. You made a mistake, he said. Whatever you think you've done, you've just signed your own transfer. Dana said nothing. You think people like you can walk in here, stir things up, and there won't be consequences? His voice lowered. You're a guest here. Don't forget that. There it was. The real voice. The one that lived beneath policy handbooks and wellness slogans. She'd heard it before. In different places. From different men. Always the same hunger for control. I'm not a guest, Dana replied. I'm a witness. Barry stepped closer. You're a liability. And you're scared. That landed. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She knew what was coming next. He tried to discredit her. Maybe dig up her own past. She had one, like everyone here. Things they didn't talk about. Pain they learned to pack neatly in boxes labeled resilience. They would say she was unstable. That she was imagining things. That she had a vendetta. And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. She did have a vendetta. Not personal. Systemic. Because she had watched what happened when places like this became factories for despair, where people cycled through just to disappear on the other side, more broken than before. That was her weakness once, believing that systems were meant to help. But now, she knew better. After the confrontation, they isolated her. Not overtly. Not with punishment or warnings. Just absence. No more session invites. No shared chores. Her name disappeared from volunteer lists. When she asked questions, people changed the subject. Elise avoided her eyes. Even some residents, once friendly, now looked away. They were afraid. She didn't blame them. The audit had begun in silence, files reviewed in offices behind locked doors, but whispers leaked out. Questions were being asked. Staff were pulled aside. And Dana became a ghost with a spotlight on her back. The next week dragged like a slow fall. She wasn't transferred, but she wasn't exactly allowed to remain, either. They left her in limbo, hoping the quiet pressure would break her down. But Dana didn't come from comfort. She came from storms. So she waited. Waited until one of the FEMA contacts finally reached out, not with confirmation, but with caution. "There's movement," the woman said on the call, her voice careful. "Internal Affairs is opening a wider investigation. But you need to be careful. There are people here who don't want this public." Dana already knew that. She could feel it in the way Barry no longer made threats, just observations, like, "Shelters like this don't survive bad press," or "Sometimes whistleblowers ruin more than they fix." She also knew it meant he was losing ground. And then came the turning point. One of the residents, Thomas, a quiet older man with a limp and a chronic cough, collapsed in the hallway. Staff barely responded. Dana rushed to help, demanded they check his file. It was empty. No medication logs. No health notes. No evidence he'd even been prescribed the inhaler he used to carry. They'd erased him. Dana exploded. In front of everyone. She didn't scream, but her voice cut clean through the hallway air. She demanded names. Demanded responsibility. And when staff tried to escort her out, several residents stepped forward. For the first time, someone else stood beside her. And then another. And another. The silence broke. People started talking. About missed appointments. About lost medication. About threats if they asked too many questions. About Dana being the only one who had listened, who had written things down, who had treated them like they weren't just numbers in a spreadsheet. Dana stood back, hands trembling, heart pounding. This was it. The reckoning. Not hers, theirs. Not because of her voice alone, but because others finally remembered theirs. The shelter didn't shut down. That's what most of the residents expected in the days after the confrontation. Rumors spread fast of news crews sniffing around, of federal agencies making quiet visits, of Barry leaving in the middle of the night with 2 boxes and a forced smile. Some said the board had dissolved. Others whispered about lawsuits. But the building stayed. The meals kept coming. The beds remained made. What changed wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was structural. Subtle. There were new people at the front desk, younger staff with clipboards who didn't speak in rehearsed lines. Elise was gone, quietly reassigned. Thomas was taken to a hospital and returned with actual prescriptions and follow-up appointments. Dana noticed a new suggestion box near the front exit unlocked. Transparent. Read daily. It was a start. But Dana wasn't staying. The decision didn't come from anger or bitterness. In truth, she had grown used to the rhythm of the shelter, the low hum of survival, the camaraderie of shared silence. Yet something inside her told her she wasn't meant to anchor herself to this place. Not anymore. Not after what it had demanded of her. The day she left, no one gave a speech. There were no farewells in a line. Just quiet nods, small gestures, a thermos slipped into her bag, a pair of socks folded neatly with a note that read, "For wherever you're going next." And one resident, Lucinda, barely 19, always quiet in group therapy, approached her as she waited for a ride. "I saw what you did," Lucinda said, barely above a whisper. "Before you. I thought we were invisible." Dana didn't respond right away. She reached into her bag and handed Lucinda a worn-out notebook, pages filled with scribbled names, dates, patterns, proof. "Keep writing things down," she said. "Your voice matters." The car pulled up. Dana slid in without ceremony. As the shelter receded behind her, so did its shadows. But not its impact. She didn't return to the life she had before the shelter. That life was already behind her. Its bridges burned long ago. Instead, she carved out something new, small workshops in community centers, working with other displaced women, helping them navigate bureaucracy, understand their rights, find their footing. She never called herself an activist. She wasn't trying to start a movement. But her name began to appear in conversations, in underground forums, in whispered circles of overworked social workers and burnt-out case managers. Dana Cole, the woman who stood up to the system from inside the shelter. A few months later, a local journalist tracked her down, hoping for an interview. They wanted the scandal, the big expose. They wanted names, outrage, headlines. Dana agreed to meet, but only if the story focused on the residents, the patterns, the quiet negligence, the way the system weaponized hopelessness. When the article came out, it didn't name Barry or Elise. It didn't go viral, but it did land on the desk of someone who mattered. FEMA launched a full-scale review of privately run shelters across 3 states. And more importantly, a woman in another shelter, 2 counties over, clipped out the article and taped it to her bunk wall. Underlined, in red ink, were Dana's final words from the interview. Being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's an advantage, if you know who you are when they try to define you. 1 year later, Dana stood outside a newly built community space. Brick walls, bright windows, no fences. It wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a government office. It was something in between. A place where people didn't have to be fixed before they were welcomed. She'd been invited as a guest speaker. Not because she had letters after her name, or because she'd written a book. She hadn't. But because word had spread about the woman who never raised her voice, but made people listen anyway. Inside, the room buzzed with energy. Folding chairs, coffee in chipped mugs, faces full of weariness and will. Dana didn't take the stage. She sat among them, shared her story, not with fire, but with clarity. She didn't tell them she was brave. She told them she was tired, angry, lonely, but also alive. And that was enough. And when she looked up, she saw Lucinda in the back, older now, eyes sharper, holding her own notebook. Dana smiled. The sound of change, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a pen on paper. Sometimes it was breath drawn before a truth. Sometimes it was the silence that came after people finally listened. And in that silence, Dana Cole had built something lasting.